October 17, 1944, Camp Algona, Minnesota. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant, earthy smell of turned soil from the prison farm. A slow, cold drizzle mists the cheeks of the men standing in neat rows, their postures rigid, their faces a mosaic of apprehension and raw curiosity. They are soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the Afrika Korps, the Kriegsmarine, but here, in the heartland of America, they are simply prisoners of war. Before them, a camp officer stands on a small crate, not holding a weapon, but a piece of chalk. And behind him, nailed to the side of a rough-hewn barracks, is a freshly painted blackboard. The silence is broken, not by a command, but by a question that would have been ludicrous on the battlefields of Europe. Who among you wishes to learn? The question did not simply hang in the air. It seemed to defy the very physics of the prison camp. Sound here was meant for barked orders, the clang of metal doors, the tread of boots. It was not meant for this, a calm, almost pedagogical inquiry. For Obergefreiter Carl Schmidt, who had last seen his university classroom in Heidelberg in 1939, the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. His hands, calloused from years of handling artillery shells, twitched at his sides. Learning? Here? The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing. This was not an isolated moment of madness in a single camp. From the sprawling compounds of the American Midwest to the more austere facilities in Great Britain, a quiet revolution was being organized. The engine of this revolution was a deliberately broad interpretation of the Geneva Convention's Article 17. While the framers of the document likely envisioned little more than the provision of playing cards and checkers, Allied camp administrators saw a grander possibility. They were dealing with what one British report termed a captive generation, young men whose formative years have been stolen by war and ideology. Solution, proposed by a coalition of forward-thinking officers and civilian advisors, was not merely to imprison the body, but to re-engage the mind. It was a strategic calculation, wrapped in a humanitarian impulse. An intellectually stimulated prisoner is less likely to dig escape tunnels, and a re-educated prisoner is less likely to reignite the embers of Nazism upon repatriation. The initial skepticism within the wire was a thick, tangible fog. In Camp Hearne, Texas, rumors spread that the offered English lessons were a covert intelligence operation designed to trick men into revealing military secrets in a language they thought the guards wouldn't understand. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, the first crates of books donated by the local community were viewed with deep suspicion. Were these texts poisoned with propaganda? Would they be used to identify and punish those with intellectual backgrounds? The Nazi worldview had meticulously constructed the other as a cultural and moral inferior. To accept an offer of education from this same other was to risk the entire psychological framework that had sustained them through the war. The first cracks in this wall of suspicion appeared not in grand lectures, but in small, almost invisible acts of curiosity. A former engineering student, lured by the title of a textbook left on a mess hall table, would find his finger tracing the familiar diagrams of electrical circuits. A farmer's son from Bavaria, seeing a manual on modern agricultural techniques, would surreptitiously read a paragraph about soil rotation. The hunger was there, buried under layers of indoctrination and trauma. It was a hunger not just for knowledge, but for normalcy, for a connection to the person each man had been before he put on a uniform. The American and British response to this tentative interest was swift and surprisingly resourceful. They established camp universities, not with brick and mortar, but with bureaucracy and paperwork. They created systems for the prisoners to formally request specific subjects. They reached out to universities, libraries, and professional associations, soliciting donations of everything from slide rules and architectural drafting sets to classical literature and legal texts. They identified the experts in stripes, the PhDs, engineers, lawyers, and master craftsmen hidden among the prisoner population, and gave them chalk and a platform. The classroom was often just a cleared space in a barracks. The desks were repurposed crates, and the light was a single, bare bulb. But it was enough. The transformation was gradual but profound. The act of learning became a form of psychological liberation. Within the confines of the classroom, the rigid hierarchy of the German military dissolved. A lowly private could correct a Hauptmann on a point of mathematics. The shared pursuit of knowledge created new bonds, forging a community that transcended the old divisions of unit and rank. For an hour each day, these men were not prisoners and captors. They were students and teachers, collaborators in a republic of the mind. They were stepping out of the shadow of the swastika and into the light of a shared human enterprise, setting the stage for a curriculum that would soon expand far beyond basic literacy and into the very foundations of a democratic society. The initial skepticism had melted away, replaced by a fervent, almost desperate intellectual energy. But goodwill and a few donated books were not enough to build a university. The prisoners' hunger for knowledge now demanded a structure, a blueprint. And so, from the bottom up, they began to construct an educational system where none should have existed. It began with handwritten lists, circulated furtively between bunks. One man wanted to improve his English for practical reasons, hoping it might lead to a better work detail or easier communication. Another, a former medical student, desperately requested anatomy textbooks to reclaim the years stolen from his studies. A third, a farmer, asked for anything on modern agricultural science. These lists coalesced into formal petitions, presented to the camp's internal leadership, often the highest-ranking German officer, who then negotiated with the American commandant. What emerged was a staggering breadth of subjects, a mirror reflecting the diverse intellects trapped behind the wire. This was not a standardized, state-mandated education. It was an organic, democratic explosion of learning. The core offerings were practical. English language was the most popular, a key they believed could unlock their immediate world and perhaps their future. The classrooms often just cleared spaces in a barracks designated as the Lager Universität, Camp University, buzzed with the study of mathematics, physics, chemistry, and engineering. The procurement of materials became a testament to human ingenuity. With paper scarce, prisoners used the margins of old newspapers, the blank sides of propaganda leaflets, and even, in one documented case, the inside of cement bags smoothed flat. Ink was made from soot and oil. Quills were fashioned from chicken feathers donated from the camp kitchen. Slide rules, essential for engineering students, were carved meticulously from wood by carpenters, their logarithmic scales painstakingly hand-drawn and verified by the camp's mathematics professors. Each textbook was a treasure, passed from hand to hand until its spine disintegrated, its pages tissue-thin from constant study. The American authorities, initially facilitators, became increasingly impressed and supportive. They provided blackboards, chalk, and crucially, access to external examination bodies. The University of London, through the Red Cross, offered its correspondence courses. Prisoners could sit for exams under the supervision of their own professors in stripes, with the papers sent to London for grading. Earning a diploma from a prestigious institution while being a prisoner of war was a psychological victory of immeasurable scale. It was a tangible piece of a future beyond the war, a document that screamed, "I am more than my captivity." Beyond the sciences and languages, the humanities flourished in a way that was deeply subversive to Nazi ideology. Courses in history, philosophy, and political science began to appear. Men who had been taught a distorted, nationalist version of history were now exposed to primary sources and alternative interpretations. They debated the philosophies of Kant and Hegel, not as tools for state propaganda, but as systems of pure thought. This was dangerous, exhilarating territory. It forced them to confront the intellectual foundations of the regime they had served. The classroom became a space for deconstruction, where the certainties they had carried into battle were slowly, methodically taken apart. The blueprint for their minds was no longer being drawn by the Third Reich. They were drafting it themselves, line by careful line. And the design was fundamentally, profoundly human. The soul of the Camp University was not its makeshift classrooms, but its faculty, the Dozenten, the professors in stripes. These were men like Dr. Friedrich Fuchs, a renowned botanist from Munich, who now taught biology using weeds plucked from the camp's perimeter. Or Professor Emil Becker, a civil engineer who illustrated structural principles with sketches of the camp's own water tower. Their authority derived not from rank or title, but from a universally recognized mastery of their subject. In this inverted world, a private, with a doctorate in physics, could command the rapt attention of a colonel. The relationship between these intellectual leaders and the camp's traditional military hierarchy was complex and often fraught with tension. The Lagerführer, the senior German officer, was responsible for discipline and order, a role built on a chain of command. The professors, however, presided over a meritocracy. A sharp, young corporal could be the star of a mathematics class, outshining his superiors. This created a subtle but significant power shift. Intellectual prowess became a new form of currency, one that could, at times, outweigh military rank. It was a quiet lesson in democratic principles playing out in real time. The pedagogical challenges were immense. Professors had to lecture without adequate textbooks, demonstrate complex chemical reactions without a proper laboratory, and teach architectural design without drafting tables. They adapted with breathtaking creativity. History lessons became vivid performances, with the professor pacing the floor, weaving narratives from memory. Language classes turned into immersive theaters, with students role-playing scenarios in English or French. Engineering problems were solved using the camp's own infrastructure as a case study, calculating the load-bearing capacity of a barracks roof or the flow rate of a water pipe. For these teacher prisoners, the work was a form of salvation. It gave them back their identity. After years of being a cog in the war machine, they were once again scholars, mentors, and guardians of knowledge. The respect they earned from their students was a balm for the soul. It was a powerful daily reaffirmation that they were more than just a number on a prisoner tag. They were not just passing on information, they were keeping the flame of civilized thought alive in a context designed for its extinction. The students, for their part, displayed a ferocious dedication that stunned their instructors. After long days of manual labor or the mind-numbing boredom of confinement, they would crowd into the drafty classrooms, their faces illuminated by a single bulb, hanging on every word. They took notes with a religious fervor. For them, this was not a pastime. It was an act of defiance and an investment in a future they were beginning to dare to imagine. The professors in stripes were not just teaching them subjects. They were providing them with the intellectual tools to dismantle their own indoctrination and rebuild their worldview from the foundation up. They were showing them that a man in a prison uniform could still possess the one thing that could never be caged: a free and curious mind. The professors in stripes had built the engine of learning, and the prisoners had fueled it with their desperate hunger for knowledge. But this educational project was about to evolve beyond technical skills and language lessons. The classroom walls, both physical and ideological, were preparing to expand, forcing a confrontation not just with academic subjects, but with the very moral universe these men had inhabited. As the war dragged into its final bloody months, a new subject began to appear on the camp blackboards, one not found in any official syllabus: the future. The study of engineering was no longer just an abstract exercise. It was a blueprint for rebuilding a shattered Europe. Agronomy became a lesson in how to feed a starving continent. This was the birth of the curriculum of hope, a deliberate pivot from the past's destruction to the future's construction. The most powerful tool in this psychological shift was exposure to a free press. While heavily censored, access to Allied newspapers and magazines provided a window onto a world the Nazi propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to obscure. Prisoners read about the Marshall Plan's nascent proposals. They saw photographs of American factories and farms, not as targets, but as models of peacetime productivity. For men whose worldview had been shaped by images of their enemies' supposed decadence and weakness, this was a corrective shock. They began to see the nations that had defeated them not as vindictive conquerors, but as potential partners in a new, stable world order. The concept of winning the peace began to take root alongside the reality of having lost the war. This external perspective was fused with a burgeoning internal cultural life that the camp authorities actively encouraged. The prisoners organized symphonies, performing Beethoven and Mozart for mixed audiences of POWs and American guards. They staged plays, from the classics of Goethe and Schiller to original works written and performed by the men. These were not mere diversions, they were acts of reclamation. They were reconnecting with the parts of German culture that the Nazis had co-opted or corrupted, asserting a cultural identity separate from the swastika. In doing so, they found common ground with their captors, who often shared an appreciation for this European cultural heritage. The most profound lessons in democracy, however, were taught not in lectures, but through daily life within the wire. The prisoners established their own democratically elected camp committees to manage the libraries, organize lecture schedules, and settle disputes. They experienced firsthand the messy, pragmatic work of self-governance, debating, compromising, and building consensus. This was a stark contrast to the top-down Führer principle absolutism they had known. An American Guard captain at Camp Atterbury remarked in a report, "They are learning democracy by living it. They are arguing about book budgets and class schedules with more passion than they ever fought for the fatherland." This environment fostered unexpected bonds. It was not uncommon to see a German prisoner and an American guard struggling to communicate over the engine of a truck. A shared technical manual opened between them. Farmers from Iowa and farmers from Bavaria exchanged tips on crop rotation across the barbed wire. These micro-level interactions humanized the enemy on both sides. The abstract, demonized other gradually dissolved, replaced by the face of a man who could fix an engine, appreciate a sonata, or worry about his family back home. The curriculum of hope was ultimately about this rehumanization, preparing these men not just for employment, but for citizenship in a world that would desperately need bridges, not walls. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 did not bring celebration to the POW camps. It brought a profound and terrifying silence. The regime for which they had fought lay in utter ruin, its horrors being exposed to the world in newsreels and photographs from liberated concentration camps. The structured reality of captivity, with its classes and routines, suddenly felt like a fragile illusion. The blackboards now seemed to hold a single unanswerable question. What did you fight for? This period triggered what can only be described as a mass examination of conscience. The classrooms, once sanctuaries of abstract knowledge, became arenas for brutal moral reckoning. The study of political philosophy was no longer theoretical. It was a direct inquest into the nature of the totalitarian state they had served. History lessons became agonizing audits of the path that led from the Weimar Republic to the ashes of Berlin. The professors in stripes now faced their most difficult task, guiding their students through a landscape of guilt, denial, and shattered identity. The prisoners fractured along psychological lines. A minority, often the younger men and the early, committed converts to the educational program, began to speak of their intellectual liberation. They openly condemned the Nazi regime, engaging in fierce debates with their comrades. They saw their captivity and education as a tragic but necessary redemption. For them, the classroom had been a de-radicalization chamber. But for many others, the initial reaction was one of defensive disbelief. The reports of genocide were dismissed as Allied atrocity propaganda, a final, cruel trick. To accept the truth was to accept that their sacrifices, the deaths of their friends, their own lost years, had been in the service of an unspeakable evil. The cognitive dissonance was too great to bear. Heated arguments erupted in the barracks. Lifelong friendships shattered over interpretations of a news article. The camp authorities observed this turmoil with a policy of non-interference, understanding that this was a painful but essential process that the men had to navigate themselves. The process of denazification within the camps was, therefore, largely self-directed. It was driven by the relentless logic of the education they had received. How could one study the rule of law and then defend the Nuremberg laws? How could one appreciate the democratic ideals in the U.S. Constitution and then justify the Enabling Act? The intellectual tools they had sharpened in class were now being turned inward, dissecting their own beliefs and actions. It was an agonizing, deeply personal intellectual journey, from certainty to doubt, from obedience to critical thought. This internal examination was compounded by a new, pressing anxiety about the future. Repatriation was no longer a distant dream, but an imminent, frightening prospect. They were not returning as heroes, but as defeated soldiers of a disgraced regime to a homeland in ruins. What value would a camp-earned diploma from the University of London hold in the rubble of Cologne or Hamburg? The hope that had been so carefully cultivated now faced its ultimate test. The knowledge they had acquired was their only currency, their only shield against despair. They were about to become the most unlikely graduates of the most unconventional universities in history, and their final examination would be the rebuilding of their own lives and nation. The silence that followed surrender was broken by the sound of slamming train car doors. Repatriation had begun. For these men, the journey home was not a return, but a leap into the unknown. Their diplomas, written in the air of the barracks, were about to be tested in the real world. The first trains crossing into the devastated occupation zone in 1946 carried a unique human cargo. The most highly educated and psychologically complex prisoners of war in history. They arrived not with spoils of war, but with handmade suitcases filled with notes, books, and diplomas. The contrast was heartbreaking. Men who had studied advanced structural engineering now walked through mountains of rubble that were once their cities. The homecoming was a brutal shock. A traumatized and starving society viewed with suspicion these men who returned well-fed and, more alarmingly, with strange ideas. They came back with American vocabulary and democratic manners, wrote one German official. For many, their education initially became a burden. Speaking of urban planning or Enlightenment philosophy sounded like an obscene frivolity when the immediate priority was finding food and shelter. Yet, it was precisely this education that would become the foundation of their contribution to the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. The engineers who had honed their skills at Camp Algona helped design the first post-war automobiles. The farmers who studied modern techniques in Nebraska implemented reforms that doubled crop yields. The architect, who once taught using only chalk and a blackboard, now led teams raising office buildings where only craters had been. The deepest influence, however, was on the reconstruction of West Germany's social and political fabric. Many of these former prisoners became teachers, journalists, and local civil servants, infusing their communities with the democratic principles they had lived firsthand. They had learned that authority could be questioned, that consensus was built, that the other could be a collaborator. One ex-prisoner who became the mayor of a mid-sized city said in an interview decades later, "We were not rebuilding Germany for the Führer, but for our children. And the only way to do it was by applying the lessons we learned from our captors: tolerance, debate, and the value of an educated mind." The camp veterans' reunions did not celebrate wartime feats, but academic and professional achievements. They called themselves the graduates of the Barbed Wire University. They corresponded with their former American and British guards, exchanging family photos and professional updates. These relationships, born from the paradox of captivity and education, became micro-bridges of reconciliation between nations that just years earlier had been locked in total war. Their legacy is a quiet but enduring testament. There is no grand monument commemorating the POW camp education. Its monument is modern Germany itself, democratic, prosperous, and firmly rooted in the West. They were a bridge generation, men who crossed the abyss of barbarity, carrying the tools for civilization, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, knowledge not only liberates the mind, but can quite literally help rebuild a world. In the silence left by the war, between the barbed wire and the watchtowers, something extraordinary happened. It was not an act of surrender, but one of rebirth. The same hands that once pulled triggers learned to hold the pencil with which they would redraw their futures. The minds that had been shaped for blind obedience were retrained for critical questioning. This is not just a story about prisoners of war. It is a timeless lesson about the resilience of the human spirit and the redemptive power of education. It reminds us that the most profound classroom may not be in grand marble halls, but in the most improbable of places, springing up like a flower through concrete, teaching us that even when the body is imprisoned, the mind can find the key to its own perpetual liberation. If this story of hope amidst despair resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. Your support helps us unearth more of these forgotten stories that quietly changed the world. Leave a comment below, telling us which other improbable miracle you'd like us to explore next.